Eleonora Ainsworth understood the architecture of ballrooms. They were elaborate cages designed to display birds of paradise, and she, at 26, was a common sparrow. She stood near a pillar draped in silk, the marble cool against her back, and watched the glittering flock. Her own gown of pale dove-grey was meant to be unassuming, a colour that did not demand attention because it had long since learned not to expect any. It was the 3rd season she had worn it, the lace at the cuffs beginning to fray ever so slightly, a secret shame she kept hidden with the careful placement of her hands. Her mother had cornered her by the lemonade table earlier, her fan fluttering like a frantic moth. "The Duke of Blackwood," she had whispered, the words sharp with a desperation that had been honing itself for years. "He has spoken to you twice this evening. Twice, Eleonora, you must not let this slip away. He is your last best hope." Eleonora had merely nodded. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing, a hothouse flower she had long since stopped trying to cultivate. Yet she could not deny the flicker of it. The Duke was a formidable man, a figure carved from shadow and silence, but his brief conversations with her had been surprisingly focused. He had asked about her interest in botany, a topic that usually glazed the eyes of most gentlemen. He had listened, his gaze direct, and for a moment she had felt seen. Now he stood across the room, a severe, dark figure in a sea of pastels. A single, shocking lock of white hair fell across his temple, a stark slash against the black, as if some great fright or sorrow had permanently marked him. It was his most distinguishing feature, more so than the title or the vast, unsmiling fortune. It made him look both older and younger than his 32 years, a man caught between 2 states of being. Lady Cressida, a diamond-bright beauty with a laugh like shattered glass, was at his side. She tapped his arm with her fan, gesturing with a tilt of her head in Eleonora's direction. Eleonora felt a familiar, cold dread pool in her stomach. She could not hear their words, but she could read the cruel amusement on Lady Cressida's face. The Duke's eyes found hers across the expanse of polished floor. There was no warmth in them, only a cool, assessing quality. He said something to Lady Cressida, and her sharp laugh echoed, drawing the attention of those nearby. A small circle of silence widened around them, an audience gathering for a play she had not known was being staged. Her mother gave her a sharp, encouraging nudge from behind a potted fern. "Go to him," the gesture commanded. "Stake your claim." Eleonora's feet felt like lead. This was a mistake. This was a performance, and she had forgotten all her lines. Still, she moved, propelled by years of filial duty and the faint dying ember of that foolish hope. As she approached, Lady Cressida's voice carried, deliberately pitched to be overheard. "Surely, Your Grace, you do not mean to cultivate such a quiet little wallflower?" One hears she is quite rooted to the spot. The Duke of Blackwood did not look at Lady Cressida. His gaze remained fixed on Eleonora, who had stopped a few feet away, trapped in the expectant silence. He had the power to save her or to ruin her with a single word. He smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth, a mere baring of teeth. "I am not in the market for a hardy perennial, Lady Cressida," he said, his voice carrying with perfect clarity. However well preserved, the words struck her with the physical force of a blow. Perennial well preserved. He had reduced her to a garden specimen, old and durable and utterly undazzling. A wave of heat washed over her skin, followed by an unnerving, absolute cold. The laughter of the small crowd was a distant buzzing sound, like angry bees. She saw her own humiliation reflected in his mahogany dark eyes. He was waiting for the expected response. He was waiting for the flush of shame, the stammered retreat, the glistening tears of a woman undone. It was what he was owed. It was the tribute his power demanded. But the tears did not come. In their place, a strange and terrible calm descended. It was as if the part of her that cared for such things, the part that could be wounded by the casual cruelty of a man like him, had simply withered and died on the spot. What was left was something hard and smooth and cool, like a river stone. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. She held it until he was the one who looked momentarily unsettled. She inclined her head, a gesture of regal finality. "Thank you for your candour, Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly level, without a single tremor. "I assure you I shall be perfectly fine." Then she turned. She did not rush. She did not falter. She walked away, her back as straight as a queen's, threading her way through the parted sea of gawking guests. She did not look for her mother. She did not look for an escape. She simply walked toward the doors, each step a silent declaration. He expected tears. He got silence. The silence, she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, was so much worse. The days that followed the Duke's dismissal were not filled with weeping and sorrow. Eleonora had expected a period of mourning for her pride, but she found she had nothing to mourn. The part of her that had been slain in that ballroom had been the part that lived on the opinions of others. Its death was not a loss, but a liberation. She formally announced to her stunned parents that she was withdrawing from society, not just for the season, but for good. Her father, a man who preferred peace to conflict, had merely sighed. Her mother had been apoplectic. "You are throwing away your life." She had cried, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief into a knot. "You will be a spinster, a burden, an object of pity." "I was already an object of pity, Mother," Eleonora had replied, her voice calm. "I simply choose not to participate in the spectacle any longer." She retreated to the small, neglected glasshouse at the back of their London garden. It was her sanctuary, a world of damp soil and patient green life. Here, her value was not measured by her dowry or her wit in a drawing room, but by the steadiness of her hand and the depth of her knowledge. She began to work again on her portfolio of botanical illustrations, her focus absolute. Her current project was a night-blooming cereus, a strange spectral flower that bloomed only once, in darkness, for a single night, before dying at dawn. It was a difficult subject, demanding patience and precision. She worked for hours, grinding her own pigments, her brushstrokes capturing the translucent lunar beauty of the petals. The quiet scratch of charcoal on vellum was the only sound she needed. One afternoon, her friend Lady Beatrice came to call. Beatrice, comfortably married to a portly, kind baron, swept into the glasshouse, her silks rustling. "My dear Eleonora, the entire city is talking." "I imagine they are," Eleonora said, not looking up from a delicate wash of white she was applying to a petal. "They say the Duke of Blackwood looks like a thundercloud. He goes to every event, but he speaks to no one. He just watches the door. They say he looks for you." Beatrice lowered her voice. "They say he expected you to fall apart, to languish. Instead, you have simply vanished, and it is driving him mad." Eleonora felt a flicker of something, not triumph, but a grim sort of vindication. "I am not languishing. I am working." "We can all see that," Beatrice said, her tone softening with admiration. "You have become a mystery, Nora, the woman who walked away. In a city that trades on gossip and drama, your peace is the most scandalous thing of all." Her peace was real. It settled in her bones, a quiet strength she had never known she possessed. She began to venture out, not to balls or soirees, but to Kew Gardens and to the Royal Society's public lectures. She went for herself, to learn and to observe, and because she was no longer looking for a husband, she moved with a new, unburdened grace. It was at a museum, before a case of preserved Amazonian butterflies, that she saw him again. The Duke of Blackwood stood not 10 feet away, ostensibly examining a collection of beetles, but she felt his eyes on her. It was a heavy, probing gaze, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. She did not flee. She did not blush or look away. She simply met his stare, held it for a polite moment, and then gave him a small, cool nod of acknowledgement before turning back to the butterflies. The nod was a masterpiece of civility. It said, "I see you, I remember you, and you do not matter." She could feel his shock across the distance between them. It was a palpable thing. He took a step toward her, his mouth opening as if to speak, but she had already moved on, drifting down the long gallery, her focus entirely on the exhibits. She did not look back. She knew, without seeing, that he was left standing there, staring after her. The most powerful man in the room, rendered utterly powerless by a woman who wanted nothing from him. Her newfound serenity made her magnetic in a way she had never been before. Without the desperate, searching energy of an unmarried woman on the market, she was simply interesting. Gentlemen who had previously overlooked her now found themselves drawn to her quiet confidence. One such man was Viscount Hayes, a soft-spoken scholar with a passion for ancient history. He did not approach her with practiced flattery, but with a genuine question about a Roman artifact. Their conversation was easy and intelligent. He began to seek her out at lectures and in the lending libraries, always with a new topic to discuss, a new discovery to share. Lord Hayes was kind. He saw her not as a perennial to be preserved, but as a mind to be engaged. His courtship, if it could be called that, was a slow, pleasant thing, like a rambling walk on a sunny afternoon. Her mother was thrilled, seeing a respectable, if not brilliant, match finally on the horizon. Eleonora herself was simply content. A life with Lord Hayes would be peaceful. It would be safe. The Duke of Blackwood, however, seemed to view the Viscount's attendance as a personal affront. Eleonora would see him at the edges of rooms, his dark eyes fixed on her and Lord Hayes, his expression unreadable but intense. His presence was a low, constant hum of tension beneath the surface of her calm new life. The conflict came to a head at a garden party. Eleonora was discussing the difficulty of cultivating Himalayan poppies with Lord Hayes when she overheard the Duke's voice from a nearby group. His tone was laced with a familiar, cutting condescension. "Viscount Hayes?" the Duke said, loud enough to be heard. "A fine man, if you have an interest in dusty pots and forgotten kings. He spends more time with the dead than the living. A woman would have to be quite desperate for a bit of company to attach herself to him." The insult was aimed at her as much as at the Viscount. The old Eleonora would have shrunk away, mortified. The new Eleonora felt a surge of cold, clear anger. Lord Hayes had shown her nothing but respect, and she would not see him maligned by a man whose own cruelty was a matter of public record. She excused herself from the Viscount and walked directly toward the Duke's circle. The men fell silent as she approached. She stopped before him, her gaze unflinching. "Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "You are mistaken. Lord Hayes's passion for history is what makes his company so invigorating. Unlike some, his interests lie in things of substance and lasting value. not in the fleeting cruelty of a moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet precision of her words did more damage than a shout ever could. She had defended another. She had challenged him directly. The Duke's face, for the first time since she had known him, was utterly stripped of its customary arrogance. He looked stunned, as if she had struck him. "Lord Hayes is a gentleman," she continued, pressing her advantage. "A quality one learns to value above all others." With a final, pointed look, she turned and walked back to the Viscount's side, leaving the Duke of Blackwood standing in a silence of his own making. The balance of power had shifted. She was no longer the one being judged. She was the one setting the terms, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this quiet act of defiance had undone him more than any public rejection ever could have. His attempt to wound her had only succeeded in showing her the strength of her own armour. Her composure settled over the lawn like a fine layer of dust, silencing everything. The invitation to the Duchess of Abernathy's autumn house party was a command. To refuse would be a social slight of the highest order. Eleonora knew, with a sense of weary inevitability, that both the Duke of Blackwood and Viscount Hayes would be in attendance. The carefully constructed piece of her London life was about to be tested in the crucible of a country estate. She arrived to find the estate bathed in the golden, melancholic light of late September. The air was crisp with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. For the first few days, she managed to maintain a polite distance from the Duke. She walked the gardens with Lord Hayes, played cards with Beatrice, who was also a guest, and spent her evenings reading in the cavernous, quiet library. She had brought her illustration of the night blooming serious with her, determined to finish it. It was nearly complete, needing only the final, delicate shading on the stamen. The work grounded her, a private ritual in a public space. On the third night, she found herself alone in the library long after the other guests had retired. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows over the towering shelves of books. The only other light was the single candle on her worktable, illuminating the ghostly white flower on her paper. She was so absorbed she did not hear him enter. "It is beautiful." The voice, low and close, startled her. She looked up to see the Duke of Blackwood standing beside her table. He was not dressed for dinner, but in a simple dark coat, his cravat loosened. The stark white lock at his temple seemed almost luminous in the firelight. He looked tired, the rigid control he usually maintained over his features noticeably absent. "Your Grace," she said, her voice cool, her hand instinctively moving to cover her drawing. "Please, do not hide it," he said softly. "I have never seen work of such precision, such life." He was looking at the drawing, but she felt his words were about more than just the art. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the hiss and pop of the fire. She waited for him to make some cutting remark, to retreat back into his armour of arrogance. Instead, he simply stood there watching her, his presence a heavy weight in the quiet room. "I behaved abominably," he said at last, the words seeming to be pulled from him. "At the ball, in the garden, there is no excuse for my conduct." Eleonora did not reply. She would not make this easy for him. She had given him no reason to believe she was interested in his apology. He seemed to understand. He drew a deep breath, his gaze falling to the fire. "I owe you an explanation, not as an excuse, but as a reason." He paused. "Years ago I was to be married. I loved her, or I believed I did. She was the toast of the season, beautiful and celebrated. 2 days before our wedding, she eloped with my cousin, leaving a note for me that was read aloud at our club for the amusement of my friends. They said I had been a fool, that I was too serious, too cold, that I had driven her away. He spoke in a flat monotone, as if reciting a history that belonged to someone else. But Eleonora could see the flicker of old pain in his eyes, the tightening of the muscles in his jaw. His laugh from that night in the ballroom suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. It had been the grate of a key in a rusted lock, forced open after years of disuse. I swore I would never be made a fool of again, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. I learnt to be what they expected. Cold, unfeeling, powerful, I learnt to strike first. That night, when I saw you, I saw the hope in your eyes. It was the same hope I once had, and it terrified me. So I did what I had learnt to do. I destroyed it. It was a monstrous act. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were stripped bare of all artifice. She saw not a duke, but a man haunted by his own defences. I expected you to break, he confessed, his voice cracking slightly. I wanted you to cry, to flee, to prove that my cruelty had power. When you did not, when you simply walked away with that impossible calm, you broke me instead. You held up a mirror, and I saw the wretch I had become. Your peace has given me none. He stood before her, utterly vulnerable. He had taken off his armour, piece by piece, and laid it at her feet. He had given her the story of his deepest wound, the source of his bitterness. He had handed her the definitive proof of her victory, not that she had ever sought one. The power in the room was now entirely hers. She could soothe him, or she could leave him to bleed. The silence that followed was profound. She looked from his tormented face to the drawing on the table, the Sirius, a flower that bloomed in darkness, a fragile, transient beauty. She had survived her own night of humiliation and found a strength she never knew she possessed. He, it seemed, was still lost in his. The following morning, Lord Hayes found her in the rose garden, the last of the autumn blooms clinging stubbornly to their thorny stems. He was, as always, gentle and considerate. He spoke of his estate in Kent, of his library, of the quiet life he could offer her. He formally, tenderly, asked her to be his wife. You would not be troubled there, he said, his earnest eyes full of kindness. You would have your peace. I would ask for nothing more than your companionship. It was everything she should have wanted. A life of quiet dignity, of scholarly pursuits, of safety, a harbour after a storm. It was a life where she would be perfectly, comfortably fine. She looked at his kind face and felt a pang of genuine affection, but she also felt a strange sense of lack. It was the placid surface of a lake when she had just learned the power of the ocean. She thanked him and asked for a day to consider his offer. He understood, of course. He was a man who always understood. Later that afternoon, she was walking near the ornamental lake when the Duke approached her. He looked as if he had not slept. The vulnerability of the previous night was still there, raw and exposed in the pale light. He did not crowd her, but kept a respectful distance. Lady Eleonora, he began, his voice hesitant. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. My actions have forfeit any claim to your time or your thoughts. But I must ask for your forgiveness. She stopped and turned to face him fully. The memory of his words was a shard of glass she had carried, a dull, constant pressure. But now, seeing the man before her, the sharp edges seemed to have worn smooth. And if I grant it, she asked, her tone neutral. Hope flared in his eyes, so bright it was almost painful to see. Then I would ask for something more. The slimmest chance, An opportunity to earn your regard, not your hand. I know I cannot ask for that. Just a chance to show you that the man who spoke to you in the library is more real than the monster who insulted you in the ballroom. There it was, the choice laid bare. On one side, Lord Hayes and a life of guaranteed peace. On the other, the Duke of Blackwood, a man of violent contradictions, of deep wounds and a desperate, burgeoning hope for redemption. A life of turmoil, of uncertainty, but also of a passion and intensity she was only just beginning to understand. She looked at the Duke, at the powerful man made low by his own heart, and she thought of the life she had built for herself in the ashes of her public humiliation. She had found her own worth, independent of any man. She did not need a saviour. She did not need a harbour. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, Your Grace, she said, her voice soft but firm. The hope in his eyes wavered. The peace I have found is my own. It was hard won. It is not yours to disturb, nor is it yours to join. His face fell. He had expected this, she knew. It was the only just answer. He gave a single sharp nod, preparing to turn away, to accept his sentence. However, she added, and he froze. A conversation about the challenges of cultivating alpine blossoms, perhaps, would not be an entirely unwelcome disturbance. She offered him a small, conditional opening. It was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. It was a chance, but it was entirely on her terms. She was not falling into his arms, healed by his confession. She was inviting him, with immense caution, to step into her world, a world where she made the rules, where her interests were the topic of conversation, where her peace was the ground upon which they both must tread. The relief that washed over his face was profound, but it was tempered by the clear understanding that this was not a victory. It was the beginning of a long, arduous climb. For the first time, a genuine smile touched his lips, a small, uncertain thing, but it reached his eyes. The catharsis was not in a dramatic embrace, but in this quiet, tectonic shift of power. She had won, not by seeking revenge, but by becoming so thoroughly, unshakably herself, that he had no choice but to meet her on her own ground. A year passed. The seasons turned, bringing the chill of winter and the tentative green of spring. Eleonora did not marry Lord Hayes, a refusal he accepted with his customary grace. Her conversations with the Duke of Blackwood, which had begun with alpine blossoms, slowly, cautiously, branched into other topics: art, literature, philosophy, and finally, themselves. Their courtship was a strange and quiet affair, conducted not in London's ballrooms but through letters and long walks. He did not shower her with jewels or flattery. Instead, he sent her rare botanical texts from the continent and cuttings from his own neglected greenhouses. He learned her language, he learned her world. Now, in the full glorious bloom of the following autumn, Eleonora stood in the central dome of the great glass house at Blackwood Manor. For generations, it had been left to fall into disrepair, a monument of dusty, cracked glass and withered vines. Under her direction, it was being reborn. Workmen were replacing panes of glass, and gardeners were turning the soil in the long, empty beds. It was filled with light and the scent of damp earth, a place of new beginnings. Alistair, she called him Alistair now, came to stand beside her. His sleeves were rolled up, his hands smudged with soil. He had been helping her chart the placement of a new orchid collection. The stark white lock of hair was still there, a permanent reminder of his past, but the harsh, defensive lines of his face had softened. He looked at her not with the assessing gaze of a collector, but with a quiet, steady reverence. "The foreman says the new heating system will be operational by November," he said. "We can bring in the tropicals before the first frost." The word was a simple, solid thing, a foundation they had built together, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. His life of empty power had been replaced by one of shared purpose. Her life of quiet solitude had expanded to include another, without sacrificing its core. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently brush a speck of dust from the petal of a lily she was holding. His movements were patient, careful. He had learned patience. She had taught him. "Are you happy, Eleonora?" he asked, his voice low, the question holding the weight of the entire year. She looked around the vast, light-filled space at the promise of life it held. She thought of the woman in the grey dress, standing by a pillar, invisible and afraid. She thought of the woman who had walked out of that ballroom, her back straight, into an unknown future. She had built that future with her own 2 hands. She had cultivated her own peace, as carefully as any rare flower. This life with him was not a rescue, it was a partnership. She turned her gaze to him, to the man who had learned to be gentle, to be kind, to be worthy of the peace he had once tried to shatter. A true smile, warm and radiant, lit her face. "I was fine on my own, Alistair," she said softly. "I am better with you."